apparently, from what my wife and I can assess, we are sitting in Allah's refuge and are pretty much unmolested by the insanity that is affecting most of the world. Rural Kentucky, and we have our basic necessities are provided, and we're living in peace, and we're able to study what we need to study on a daily basis, and do what we need to do on a daily basis to meet our responsibilities. So, I mean, it doesn't get very much better than that without, interference with by from people who are who have a tendency to waste your time and resources on their behalf. You see, so um, Alhamdulillah, and I've been wondering, just as an aside, what you're doing there still in Malaysia after all these years. I guess you've decided to retire there. Is that so?
Well, now that you bring up the question, I can safely say that I've been asking myself the same question
Oh,
on a fairly regular basis. My
uh,
experience with Canada and Malaysia is that I have been a bit like a pendulum going back and forth. The grass always seems greener on the other side. So,
yes.
anyway, the reason that we came back to Malaysia is how do I put this? Yeah, you see, when I left the institute, I finished, that was in December 2017. So we
Mm,
stayed approximately another year because I was in the middle of writing some papers of my own this time,
mhm.
mainly related to the doctrine of abrogation, which I found to be very problematic and requiring.
Yeah, I Yeah, I
Yes.
find that very interesting. I'm very grateful that you have that you involved yourself in that work. I mean, it's something that needs to be done. So, yeah, go on.
Yeah, so I basically continued with the work because I felt that there were still some unanswered questions, and for me, and unfinished papers as well, as a matter of fact. So
Uh-huh.
when I finally finished the last of the papers, I thought, okay, I'm done. So now we can go back to Canada, and we did that in that was in October 2018, uh, and what happened there was that how do I put it? I applied for a job practically at every major think tank in the US and in Canada. And I have to admit, I don't have any hesitation to admit that basically nobody wanted my services.
I see.
Um, yeah, so so what happened? I even how do I put this? I strangely I had this huge confidence before we left Malaysia that I would be able to learn something because I felt somewhat constrained at the institute because I was not how do I put this? Um, I was not permitted to write on the subject of jihad.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, and I was quite, I was half finished doing a paper on it, in fact, when I got an email from a brother at the Institute telling me that, hey, the boss doesn't want you to write a paper on jihad. So I had to drop the matter, although
mhm.
I came back to it later after I left the Institute. And after I got more deeply into the research, I think I found out the reason why perhaps my former boss and mentor, Prof. Kamali, didn't want me to go down that particular rabbit hole
Mhm.
is because I found a whole, how do I put this, whole series of anomalies, you see, in the whole jurisprudence of jihad. I found, I mean, I think he himself touched on it one time when he said in a boardroom meeting with us, the research fellows, that this whole concept of the Darul Islam versus Darul Harb, or the abode of peace versus the abode of war, which, by the way, is very similar to Huntington's theory of the clash of civilizations. He basically said that this concept of the Darul Islam versus Darul Harb had no foundation whatsoever in the Quran. and he is right about that. But as you know, this principle that there's this implacable conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims has been made into a foundational principle of militant Islam or political Islam, if you like.
Yes, yes.
People like Said Qutb supported it wholeheartedly, and I think also
Mhm.
Maududi and Ibn Taymiyyah and a few other people. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that perhaps he wanted to. Let's look on the bright side. I think he wanted to spare me the agony, perhaps, of discovering this unpleasant truth about traditional jurisprudence. So
Being kind, I think.
yeah, but I was just wondering whether he was not being a little too kind because because some people, because I just wanted to know because I mean, what's going on here,
Yes.
so I still remember telling one of my professors of political science back in Canada at the University of Guelph when he asked us or asked me, why do you want to study political science? And I respond, I still remember my words with the following words. Well, I quote, if I may quote myself, I said, well, I would like to find out what's going on. End of quote. In other words, I guess I knew enough to realize that there was a lot that I did not know, and so I wanted to get some clarity about what is going on, in our country, which at that time was Canada, and in the broader world. So I think basically he wanted to spare me that and protect me from these perhaps less than pleasant truths that I would discover if I went more deeply into the matter, because in
Mhm.
fact one of our former staff also, I don't want to identify her by name, but she told me once that he said that he remarked about he said that, oh, that Abdul Karim, he leaves no stone unturned.
Yes.
So I like to dig into it, and I have to admit that once I began to lift turn those stones over, I have to say that my goodness, really, I found a snake almost under every stone,
Yes.
So the whole theory of jihad, I think, the militant jihad al-Talab
Mhm.
is deeply flawed, as even Yusuf al-Qaradawi admits in his recent 2009 book called The Fiqh of Jihad,
Mhm.
in which he basically states that, well, we traditional scholars didn't get it quite right about this concept of jihad al-talab or aggressive jihad. And so basically he was soft pedaling on the whole issue and tried
Mhm.
to work it out of jurisprudence, as it were, or,
Mhm.
he was doing it in the gentlest of ways. And by the way, the troubling thing about this concept of the aggressive jihad is that this was an opinion that was supported, it appears, by the majority of the Muslim jurists at the time. According
Mhm.
to Ibn Rushd, in his own book of Jihad, he says that the majority, the majority of the Muslim ulama accepted and endorsed this doctrine of Jihad al-Talab.
Mhm.
That is, I don't know whether I should drop any names here or no. Maybe I should. Even Imam al-Shafi supported the doctrine of
Mhm.
al-Talab, and hundreds of millions of people follow him, including
Yes.
ourselves here in Malaysia. And he
Mhm.
supported the jihad, concept of aggressive jihad, on the basis of accepting the alleged abrogation of 120 peace verses by one solitary verse in Surah Tawbah, verse number 5, normally referred to as the verse of the sword. So the other people that also endorse Jihad al-Talab include none other than our great luminary Imam al-Ghazali.
Mhm.
And also, Mawardi also endorsed Jihad al-Talab, and I even found a paragraph endorsing Jihad al-Talab in the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. So I began to ask myself, what is going on here? Is there any single scholar actually that was against it? And I have to admit, I could not identify a single name of a single scholar who actually opposed the doctrine of aggressive jihad.
My
Because
goodness.
Yeah, we need to remember what does the doctrine of aggressive jihad teach. First of all, and this is very troubling, perhaps the most troubling aspect of it, is
Mm.
that the concept of jihad al-talab basically transforms Islam as a religion of peace into Islam as a religion of war. Now, to me, this is shocking. Basically, the deen has been turned upside down by the ulama that have endorsed this concept of jihad al-talab.
Mhm.
And it seems that invariably they endorsed it on the basis of the alleged abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword. And I say that because if you do not abrogate the peace verses, there's no way on earth that you would be able to support this doctrine of jihad al-talab. And let me just, emphasize what
Now,
exactly.
let me stop you here just a minute
Yeah,
so I make sure that I understand and our listeners understand clearly that this doctrine of aggressive jihad is the result of the doctrine of abrogation.
it's based on it. Yes, pretty much. Yeah,
I see. So, and you discovered that no one opposed this particular doctrine amongst some of the most honored jurists and
right.
ulama
Yes,
throughout Islamic history. So,
yes,
um, so this thing begins with an abrogation of the verses that promote Islam as the way of peace, the way of reuniting ourselves with our Creator peacefully, and also along the way with each other peacefully. So the doctrine of jihad is basically, as quote as without abrogation, is one of uh, a defensive war only. Okay,
absolutely.
so when now can we take this just one more step before I hand the mic back to you, dear brother? There are those who study warfare and they say, okay, well, the best defense is an offense. Okay, were they justifying themselves on that basis after the abrogation?
Actually, some of them were. Yes, that is
Mhm.
indeed the case. And indeed, they have an expression. Some of them refer to this jihad al-talab. They try to lend it an air of being a defensive jihad by calling it preemptive jihad, right?
Mhm.
Preemptive. In other words, you go out to get the enemy before he comes to get you, so to speak. But
Yes.
I don't believe that there's any basis for that in the Quran.
Hmm. Well, if I remember my history correctly, the Khans who managed to cross the Hindu valley and river to spread their influence in India did so at the expense of the Indians, who were not at the least bit interested in moving their influences westward. So this was not preemptive in the least. These what
Right.
happened to India as a result of the Moguls, etc., etc. This was simply, well, it appears to me to be simple imperialism. Um, Based on using religious ideations as a foundation and justification. And I've always held that position. Not being a Muslim jurist, I mean, there's no way that I would know these things, the things that you've discovered under these rocks, as you spoke, as you said. So I wouldn't know, but it just makes sense to anyone who's retained their common sense and has gained insight into the historical facts of the matter, that this was in fact what happened, that the religion had nothing to do with the spread of Islam. And now I'm sadly have to confess that I'm very sadly influenced and affected by your confession here, because I've listened to many a Christian critic of Islam say Islam is a religion of war. It's a religion of the sword. It was spread by the sword. And I had to, say, well, no, that's not what Islam is. Not, it wasn't my reading of the Quran. So it's only a reading of the opinions of these jurists who have abrogated the Quran okay, in favor of this policy. Now, people like me, we're converts and we're not Islamic scholars. And I suppose that most Muslims who sit on their rugs when they go to Jum'ah, they don't know these things either, I would imagine. So this is an elitist policy that has been imposed on the Ummah to the best of my understanding as I sit here and now listen to you. And it's no wonder that you, having discovered these things, such people in positions of knowledge who are aware of this matter, they don't want it to be noised abroad, which is what we're doing right now. Uh, Gosh, pretty big target on our backs. Not that I'm not used to that. I've been doing that for a long time, but I just want to state these things in words that I will help that will help our audience listen and hear what it is that you're having to say, because someone like yourself, you're speaking from a position of knowledge, and that position of knowledge has its own locution and it has its own elegance. But at the level, where you're quoting so and so and so and so, and this doctrine and that doctrine and this doctrine, and a lot of our audience are not familiar with these terms. They're just, normal pedestrians who doing their best to get by and do their best to be as moral as possible and as obedient as possible to their religion. And here you're telling us that the religion has been misguided because of these abrogations, and the Christians and others who have been criticizing Islam as a religion of the sword have a justified position. This is god awful. This is horrific. This is blasphemous, even, you see. And I'm it's shameful. It's shameful. And I don't envy you having discovered that. There are certain things I've discovered along my own journey in the study of world history and occult history, and I've been, flabbergasted by some of the things I've discovered. And I imagine that you have been shocked by these rocks that you overturned and bitten by these vipers. And then you found yourself stuck between two worlds, I imagine. Yeah, there you are at an elitist institution supported by the government in Malaysia, and who professes to be an Islamic country, according to certain of its great leaders, Tun Mahathir being amongst them. Um, and then returning to Canada where nobody wants you. Did you apply to the University of Alberta, by the way? I understand they have a very good Islamic program there.
No, actually, I didn't, but I did apply mostly to the think tanks and research institutes.
Uh-huh. So these think tanks, they don't want to touch people like you or myself for
I,
that matter. I mean, it's not that
I
we're
think, yeah, well, in retrospect, I think the reason why I was facing an uphill struggle here is because, unlike someone like Mustafa Akyol, who has written a well known book called Reopening Muslim Minds, and who, by the way, touches on also on this issue of the, doctrine of abrogation. And he does a good job in summing up the problem. He basically says, well, we Muslims have abrogated the religion of peace and replaced it with this other Islam understood as a religion of war. And remember, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi himself said, he was the leader of the ISIS terrorist group. He said, he's on record for saying that, I quote, Islam has always been a religion of war, end
yes.
of quote. So now, but in the same breath, I would like to emphasize that I'm not saying or trying to suggest that Islam was spread only by the sword. By no means. I'm sure there were many dedicated
Mhm.
dais and gentle Muslims who preached Islam the way it is the Prophet preached it, peacefully. working, as it were, from the grassroots up, rather than trying to impose it from top down, as would be the case with the Jihad al-Talab. Another excellent treatment of this topic is found in chapter 6 of Muhammad Shahrur's book. It was published in Damascus, I believe, in 2007, and it went through multiple, reprints, although it also elicited at least 22 rebuttals by some traditional ulama. The book is called Quran, Morality and Critical Reason, and it was translated by a fellow called Kreisman, and it is the only book the only one of the Shahrur's books that has been translated into English so far. It is available on the internet in PDF format for free, so if people want to access it, I would recommend. Perhaps they can find it on the internet. And Mustafa Akil's book also can be found on the internet in PDF format. They both basically, send the same message. And I have to say that I was, how do I put it? I felt somewhat, reassured when I realized that other people are coming to the same conclusion. Because when I first wrote my first paper on the issue, I wasn't aware of the work of either Mustafa Akil or Shahrur. So when I came across their work, I realized, hey, wait a minute, I'm not saying anything new here or something that has not been said by someone before me. So there is this other opinion. But in terms of the, what the people are saying, we need to, I think, be cognizant of a distinction, one distinction that Fazlur Rahman made, and the distinction that he made was between two types of Islam, not the peaceful and Islam as a religion of peace and Islam as a religion of war. His distinction was between what we call normative Islam and historical Islam. So the normative is the Islam of the Quran. The historical Islam is the Islam of how it was actually practiced. And the practice did not always live up to the theory, just like we have the difference between the ought and the is, the moral imperative and the actual practice. So we human beings have weaknesses, and sometimes we do not live up to expectations. And I think the Muslim community, perhaps I may be permitted to say, it seems that it has not always lived up to the standards articulated in the Quran. And there have been a few lapses here and there into, a sort of a gap developed between the theory, the Quran, and the practice, or what actually transpired in Muslim history. So ideally, there should be no gap between theory and practice, but that's speaking ideally. So, yes, I think we as Muslims have to acknowledge that there are some dark spots in our history, and there's no point denying it. We should not be in a denial, because if we are not prepared to admit that we made any mistakes, then what reason do we have to reform and to improve our performance next time around? So I find that there is a tendency to sweep some of these issues under the carpet and not to talk about them and pretend as if nothing of the sort ever happened, you see. So even in traditionalist discourse, you find, when I asked one of our senior staff at the institute, what caused the collapse of the Muslim empire, he replied by saying, "Well, we were attacked by the Crusaders." And then other people will add the other people will add, well, we were also attacked by the Mongols, and so we were attacked from both west and east. So is that these are external factors. So it seems that we are pointing the finger at some third parties, but very rarely do I hear people saying that, well, we made some mistakes, and that there were some external reasons for the collapse of the Muslim dominance in the world. Like, I personally don't believe that the Muslim world declined because of that the colonial powers overpowered them. If the Muslims had been strong at the time, then the colonial powers would never have been able to overpower them. So the Ummah already weakened by the time the colonial powers came, and it wasn't very difficult, I suppose, to conquer the Muslim lands. And so the result now is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as it were, turned the tables on the Muslims, and now we, the Muslims, are the zimmis, but the protected people, and the West is like who's protecting militarily the countries in the Middle East. elsewhere. So the United States has become, as it were, the policeman of the world, if you like. And so we now are become the protected people. So
Mhm.
I think my analysis of this decline is that because several factors, and I think I've outlined this in our video in the 4 steps, that Muslims basically abandon the Quran and turn to the Hadith instead, and later even, as it were, through the Hadith under the bus, so to speak, and turn to the work of the scholars or the ulama. This is actually documented and explained by none other than a Sunni scholar himself. His name is Taj Abir Al-Wani, and he was the chairman of the Triple IT Institute in Virginia, USA. So, in order to recover, I think the Ummah needs to go back to that which gave it strength in the first place, and that was Al Quran. So,
Mhm.
because Allah says in verse 11, Surah 13, that He never changes the condition of people until they change what is inside themselves. Now, we
Yes.
know conditions of the Muslim change. So I deduce from that, or I infer from that fact, that Muslims must have changed something inside themselves. So if that is the case, what was it exactly that Muslims changed inside themselves?
Mhm.
And I would suggest that what the Ummah changed inside, the people of the Ummah changed inside themselves, they exchanged the Quran as the revealed book of Allah Ta'ala for the Hadith. In other words, what was changed was what is in the Muslim hearts and minds. The Quran
Mhm.
was basically replaced by man-made narrations that do not have a rank or status of revelation and could not possibly have provided the kind of guidance that we can get from the revealed word of Allah. So that was the major error that had transpired in Muslim history. And I think the what paved the road, so to speak, for this mistake was the what I call the first error in the Muslim intellectual history, and that was the oppression and belittling of reason and its subordination to tradition. The
Yes.
moment you shut down your mind, as far as I can see, it's game over. It's game over.
Yes. Yes. Of
You
course.
won't be able to understand the Quran because you cannot understand the Quran unless you use your mind. You see, this is not rocket science. This is common sense, as you said.
Yes.
And so all the other, bad things, it was like a chain reaction of causes and effects. The one thing led to another.
Mhm.
The final result was the Jihad al-Talab and some of the aggressive ventures that Muslims undertook, like the two twin attacks on Vienna, and also the way they treated some of the foreigners, like the way the Khawarizm Shah and his deputy in Alchuk treated the Mongol traders and
Mhm.
ambassadors. That was also an act of war, actually. So, as far as I can see, unfortunately, the Muslims before us brought these disasters on themselves
Yes.
by abandoning the Quran,
Mhm.
becoming aggressive. And Allah is very clear in the Quran that He does not love aggressors. I think that's verse
Mhm.
190 Al-Baqarah.
Yes. Yes.
So that's the long and short end of it, if you ask me. But if there's anything I can add, please let me know. Thank you.
Well, um, this business with the Mongols and how their emissaries were treated, I knew this going into academic circles in Islam. I knew it because I had read the world history, as per Will and Ariel Durant, the story of civilization. It's there, you know. And if you read those volumes, there's a whole lot to be gained. And um, most of our fellows have very little insight into world history from that perspective. And just to underscore that statement, every PhD student that I had encountered when I was at ISTAC, while I was in Islam and other institutions, not a one of them, and masters and PhD students, not a one of them knew this history. They just thought they were attacked out of the blue by the sons of Genghis without provocation. They had no idea. So, this fact and other facts of Muslim aggression has purposely been hidden from students in the madrasa, students in higher education at all the Islamic institutions. I mean, I encountered students from all over the world there, as I'm sure you did. And not a one of them knew these things. When I told them these facts, they were shocked. They had no idea, you see. So this is profound ignorance. And this is the kind of ignorance that leads to an arrogance that leads to further, how shall I say, degeneration of the various institutions that they are ascribing themselves to, in professionally and personally as religious hierophants and whatnot. See, this this is completely irrational. So that brings us full circle back to where these things happened, with the suppression of reason, with the suppression of individual ability, the individual ability to think and reason and see what the facts actually are and then see them through consequently. So I'm sure that you encountered a great deal of resistance to this effort to reveal what it is that you found under the stones. Were you able to find publishers for your works?
Yes, I was, alhamdulillah, and you are looking right at him. I
Ah,
am the.
you're the publisher. I see.
Yes.
Well, that means that Allah's the publisher, then, doesn't it?
Oh, he's helping me, alhamdulillah.
Yes, I see. Yeah, I understand that. So, Um, getting back to the original question, why are you still in Malaysia? And
Yeah.
is does this have any bearing on your decision to remain there? I mean,
Yeah. Well, I'm still in Malaysia, although I had an offer from Edip Yüksel. He just floated his company, and he happily reported to us in one of our clubhouse rooms
hmm
that they were offered 400 million US dollars
hmm
to support their enterprise, which is a sort of something to do. The name of his company is Beltways. You can Google
hmm
them.
yes, yes,
So he said that if he strikes it rich, he wants to do two things. He wants to bring me over to the United States,
hmm
and then he send me all over the world to give talks in various places. So
ah,
I'm
yes.
not sure how long I will be staying here in Malaysia,
I
but
see. Well, may Allah prosper that. Edip,
inshallah,
I've had a couple of meetings with him. He's such a busy man. It's difficult to tie him down,
yeah,
um, and he has to apportion his resources very carefully. And if he's including you in this effort, that is quite a substantial endorsement because he's not someone to be taken lightly.
oh, of course,
Alhamdulillah. So I keep us posted on the
yeah,
progress of that relationship and let us know. And my own opinion is that, well, go for it, man. Go for it. And may Allah prosper this thing and bring it into fruition. Because you see, what people like I do and others that I communicate with, we're sort of acting at one level of information dissemination. You see, you are at a completely different level, and that's a level that's further inside. How shall I say? Inside the lion's den, if you you we can say it that put it that way because this is where Daniel was thrown, and Prophet Daniel was thrown, and of course the lions were told to make peace with him because he was not an enemy of Judah. He was not an enemy of the truth. He was not an enemy of Zion, which is revelation in any way. So this part of what we're doing and what you're doing individually here, I recognize it as essential to revision in a proper sense because you see, people like myself, I've been called by some academics an outsider who has his foot on the inside. And only as an outsider can I see certain things on the inside from an objective perspective. Well, that's okay, and that's to be respected in its own right, because you have someone come in to do an investigation. You want them to be sort of neutral in certain ways, so that they're not personally invested in what it is that they're examining, you see. And so I had this, I wasn't invested in the ritual, I wasn't invested in the culture, none of this. People would go out, the Muslims would go out, they celebrate Eid, it meant nothing to me, you see, because it was just not part of my upbringing. By the time I entered Islam, I was already approaching 60. So these things were not part of my culture. So I could look at this, I could look at what they were doing. I could look at Ramadan, for example, and see the hypocrisy and then reflect it. And, of course, they wouldn't want to see that reflection. But what you're doing, you see, is you're looking under the rock of Ramadan. You see, you're looking under the rocks upon which they're standing. You're digging up the foundations. I was just looking at the facade. That's a different matter. I'm looking at the facade and I'm saying, well, that's a wonderful stained glass window you got there, but what's it really depicting? It's not depicting what I read in the Quran. Whereas you're looking at the foundations. Oh my God. Well, and you're uprooting those foundations. And that's something that needs to be done because, why? Because the next generation of leaders who will become the replacement for the traditional ulama, they need to know these things. They need to know these things. So I hope that Brother Edip is in fact successful with this enterprise and can bring you on board in order to uh, uh, spread this knowledge, to spread this revelation, to show the vipers from the tribe of Dan, if you will, that are lying under these rocks and have infiltrated Islam at the very foundation, you see, to turn the Quran around and to make this hadith equal or even superior to the Quran itself through this function called abrogation, this device, this fabricated device. You see, I just listened to a Saudi Arabian mufti yesterday, and he's spouting on and on and on about revisionism. And he said, well, we need to revise, and we're the only ones qualified to do it because we're the only ones who understand Arabic. You see, well, that's the same chauvinist attitude, you see, that has, and well, then how do they justify? What do they justify? How do they justify their position? They don't justify their position with the Quran. They justify their position that sustains their authority with the Hadith. That's the only. So they create this straw man, and then they use circular logic, and the people who remain uninformed at that level, you see, of education, they just accept this, like the PhD students would have accepted the invasion of Baghdad as an external event, when in fact it was caused internally. You see, it was in fact exactly what the Khan said, a judgment of God. Had you not offended heaven, I, the hammer of God, would not be here, or so to speak. As he sat on his horse behind the khutbah podium in the masjid there in Baghdad. You see, he told everybody why. He spoke the truth. It's a moment of truth, and I'm sure everyone in that masjid at that moment could have heard the pin drop, because the silence is awesome.
Yeah.
So, dear brother, having said that and having endorsed your position, may it please Almighty Allah to continue that endorsement, his endorsement, and the spread of this knowledge. Is there anything else you want to add to that, dear brother?
Yeah, I'd just like to mention one other book that goes into these issues, which I haven't mentioned. There's a book by Saleh Ansari and Usama Hassan, published
Mhm.
in the United Kingdom by the Quilliam Foundation. And the title of the book is Tackling Takfiri Theology.
Mhm.
Also, again, this book is also available online in PDF format. And I highly recommend it because they also go into these issues and really enlighten us to the fact that, these that sort of extremism is not entirely the modern phenomenon that many Muslims think. It
Mhm.
has roots that go very far back into the past, and I would say right into the work of the early jurists, in particular those that endorse this doctrine of aggressive
Mhm.
jihad, because we have to remember the doctrine of jihad makes jihad, military jihad, aggressive jihad, into the sixth pillar of Islam, and it
Yes.
requires the Muslim community to wage war on non-Muslims once a year, every year, even when the non-Muslims are not attacking the Muslims. This is the real clincher. In other
Yes.
words, it cannot by any stretch of the imagination be
Mhm.
conceived as a war of self-defense, which
Mhm.
is the only one of two types of, two reasons that Allah permits us to wage war. One is self-defense, and the other one, I believe, is persecution or oppression. Waging war is allowed also in that case.
Mhm.
And Shahrur's analysis also confirms this, but not in any other case.
Mhm.
So I think and by the way, perhaps I could add one more example. You mentioned the sacking of Baghdad. Well, I could add to it the second sacking of Baghdad.
Yes.
Baghdad Saddam Hussein, as you know, that happened
Yes. Yes.
in history. And we will recall that Saddam Hussein also waged aggressive jihad, Jihad al-Talab, against not just one country, but two. He attacked both Kuwait and Iran. And he
Mhm.
and his people paid a heavy price for his mistake, for his arrogance, and for his ignorance.
Yes.
He was brought down by the Allies and he ended up being executed himself. So, once again, he brought this disaster on himself and his people. And I believe there are up to 1 million Iraqi people that died, civilians, mostly bombings that
Mhm.
followed up as a result of his foolish actions and un-Islamic actions, I would also add.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
where is the quality leadership in the Muslim world is one of my questions. Are
Mhm.
we having leadership vacuum in the Muslim world? Is there anyone that we can look up to as a suitable leader or a role model, as it were, for us? I don't know. Somebody mentioned Imran Khan, and there was an attempt on his life lately, and I think, one of the bodyguards paid it with his life to save his life. So I would
Mhm.
just like to add that history repeats itself. And do I need to add also the example of ISIS? They
Yes.
also waged aggressive war, Jihad al-Talab, and what happened to them? We read in
Mhm.
our four separate verses that the Sunnah of Allah never changes. If anyone becomes an aggressor, they will have to pay a price, and they did. So
Mhm.
yes, I will end on that note, and thank you once again for having me on for a discussion on these very important issues.
You're most welcome. I just want to add to that because you brought up this Takfiri theology being ancient, and in fact, I can confirm that myself from other sources. I edited several papers that were the result of collaboration between academics in Kuala Lumpur and security forces there, who had uh, intervened and arrested several Takfiris in the process of protecting the country from terrorism. And these doctrines are there. They've been there for 1,000 years or more. And these particular individuals, whether they were Malay or Indonesian or from Thailand, it didn't make any difference which Muslim group they came from. They were all adhering to the same doctrines of aggressive warfare and indiscriminate murder. So this is something which their security forces discovered. Academics discovered it along the way, but it's not something which we hear very much about from the minbar. So Again, brother, thank you once again for sharing your knowledge with us. And inshallah, we'll take up from here again next week, and maybe look under a few more rocks and see whatever vipers have been lying there for centuries. And with that having been said, dear brother, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.